Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's wonderful to see you all out here this afternoon. I am happy to be introducing Alex Shanks, who is the faith organizer and project and field director for Equality Ohio, leader of our workshop today. Alex is a 2010 graduate of Ohio Northern University, where he received his BA in organizational communication. On graduating, he worked for a denominational body of the United Methodist Church, where he created resources and trained leaders in youth and young adult educational programming. This was followed by a short stint in local church ministry, where he developed and implemented curriculum. Most recently, he made a shift toward LGBT advocacy work when he became the Ohio field organizer for Reconciling Ministries Network and the faith consultant for Why Marriage Matters Ohio. He is passionate about equipping leaders to engage in competent and compassionate advocacy, especially for the transgender community. Alex accomplishes this primarily through offering training opportunities for and promoting the voices of affirming faith communities, small business owners, educators, and corporate employee resource groups. Also, this semester, MTSO is privileged to have Alex on campus as an occasional student, and he is enrolled in my Introduction to Christian Ethics class, so this has been a great opportunity for me to hear from Alex more regularly, although we've collaborated on some other things as colleagues in the past. So I am really pleased, and I ask you to join me in welcoming Alex Shanks.
Thank you, and thank you all for being here. This training is sort of a, how do I say this without committing anybody to anything that I shouldn't be committing anybody to? This training is a part of a series that is potentially going to take place here at MTSO at some point in the future. And to sort of start the conversation a little sooner than could be planned in the timeline that we were working with, I am thankful that I've been invited to lead the first training in this series of trainings here with you today. So before I get too far into it, I work for Equality Ohio. Equality Ohio is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that educates and advocates on behalf of all Ohioans, regardless of their sexual orientation, gender identity, or expression. And we work statewide. I, as project and field director and faith organizer, which is that happened as a result of my being hired as a faith organizer and then promoted, and then we didn't hire another faith organizer. And so I get to do all the jobs. But I love them all, and faith organizing is by far one of my passions. It's the organizing work that I've certainly done the most of, and faith communities are the organizations that I've worked the most with in my time as a professional, which some might say hasn't been all that long, but it's been all of my professional career. And so I was really excited about developing this training series to help people of faith of all backgrounds become more inclusive of the LGBT community in their ministries. And at the beginning of this, one of the things that I find really important to do is to commit together, to commit to inclusion in this space. And that can look a lot of different ways. And I use the term here, inclusion, in a way that goes beyond LGBT identity, in that we have a commitment to the ideas that are shared in this space, the experiences that are shared in this space, and the people who bring all of themselves to this space, in that it's important for everyone to feel safe and comfortable in engaging in a way that is true and honest to where they come from in this, in their understanding of the LGBT community, and how to incorporate that in their ministries. Oh, can we all commit to being a welcoming space? Head nods, I like it, awesome. So I keep mentioning that this is part of a series, and I want you to know kind of which part. It is the first, as I had mentioned before, and it leads itself to these other places. And so I want to just kind of give you an overview of the training series so you understand kind of where this falls. This first training is Compassionate Competency, and with this training we spend a lot of time sort of answering the questions that many people have, not in a direct way. Like I'm not going to define for you every letter in the LGBTQ acronym, but I do want to talk about what is gender and what is sexuality, and how does that shape people's identities, and why do we use the word queer? Why is that considered more acceptable today than it was 10 years ago even? Questions like that. And so we'll talk through some of that. Faithful Kinship is a training on how to be an ally, essentially. Sanctuary is about welcoming trans people and their families into your faith community in a way that is wholesome, as it is a little different than what it looks like to welcome someone of a differing sexual orientation. Tending and Keeping the Soul is a training on how to care for yourself as an LGBTQ identified leader, or as a faith leader, care for the LGBT people in your communities. The Advocate's Call is just what it sounds like. Why are we as people of faith called to advocate for justice? And Organizing for Faithful Action is, now that we understand our call as individuals to advocacy and to justice work, how do we bring people with us? How do we engage the rest of our faith community in that mission, in that call? So Compassionate Competency, I already gave the little overview. That is what we're talking about today. But what are some words that come to mind for you when you think of LGBTQ? When you think of the LGBTQ community? This is a participatory training. Yeah. Complex, yeah. Yes, proud. I'm realizing I should probably be saying these back for people who aren't actually in this room. And there are a lot of words on the screen, many of which sort of come to mind immediately. And so I like to put them up there so we don't, go all the way through the acronym. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, genderqueer, rainbow, happiness, marriage, equality, discrimination, oppression, minority. There are plenty, is kind of the point, right? There are lots of words that describe LGBTQ identities, and there are a lot of things that people can think of when they start to think of the LGBT community. But I think one thing that's important to remember as we try to engage LGBT people in ministry context is that the things that make someone an LGBTQ person are characteristics that all humans have. That in our differences, we start from a place of similarity. So I'm going to talk through, sort of where those differences emerge a little bit, and we're going to go through some labels, some of the common labels that we use when we're talking about LGBT people, or when an LGBT person is identifying themselves publicly, coming out publicly. But I want to make a slight caveat, or a slight disclaimer, I suppose, that labels are and will always be limited descriptors of human beings. That in our similarities and in our differences, in our uniqueness as beings, that we are also we are attempting to put a label on something that is so dynamic. It's ever changing, it's ever evolving, and what someone may use as a label today may change slightly, even in the way that they're using it, in a matter of moments. But so that we can kind of have some context for who we're talking to, right? If I am having a conversation with someone and for some reason I feel the need that they need to know that I am a trans man of color who identifies sexually as queer, then it would be awfully nice if they had some context as to what I kind of mean by that. And so that's what we're going to do here for a little bit together. I use the gender unicorn as a visual for folks to kind of follow with me through some of these categories, through what is sexuality, what is gender identity, and things like that. But just like labels are limited, visuals are also limited in their ability to fully explain these constructs. For example, one thing that I find to be really limiting about this particular example is that I, as a human being, am not a fantastical creature. I'm not a unicorn, but I suppose unicorns are fun, and so it made for an interesting image to the folks who created this. But please do not assume that another visual is the genderbread person. Like, I'm also not a cookie, but again, this is a visual that has been made, and I otherwise I really think it's a great tool and resource to use for conversation. So let's start right in the middle there with sex assigned at birth. Whenever I talk about sex assigned at birth, really all it is like, what genitals do you have? To the extent that, like, what genitals are the most dominant, even. Other than that, doctors don't really know much about you, neither do your parents, for that matter. And so what we typically deduce from sex assigned at birth in our society is who you will be attracted to, and what toys you will like to play with, and what your favorite color might be, what gender you'll identify with, what social norms you should be taught to adhere to. But sex assigned at birth really doesn't tell us any of that. We just deduce that as a society on our own. And at times, what we sort of assume as a society will come from someone who's, for example, is assigned female at birth, is not accurate. And that is when we start to have many LGBTQ identified youth will start to struggle with mental health, or they'll struggle with their spirituality. And I think it's a great opportunity for people of faith to show the love that almost every faith teaches, right? I can't think of a faith tradition that does not teach people to love and care for one another. So I think it's a great opportunity for people of faith to really step in and say that what we assumed about you does not have to be true. And it's okay for you as a young person who's exploring all of these things to stand up and to say that this is me, that this is who I am, and know that God will love you regardless of who that is. Matter of fact, God already knows who that person is. And we will love you as representatives of the God that we serve. And so the first thing that really starts to develop in young people from a sort of child psychology perspective is gender identity. Personal story. I sort of first remember struggling with my gender identity as a trans man as a young child when I was about 5 years old, 5 or 6, which is a little older than many doctors would say that I may have been showing signs of that. That's my first real strong recollection of that struggle. Some doctors will say that kids around the age of 18 months to 2 years will start to form a gender identity. And they will know, their brains will know what that gender identity is. So I've met some, 7-year-old little trans girls who told their parents, I'm a girl at 2 years old. I'm thinking of one in particular. She's kind of sassy. I was not sassy as a kid. I was like people pleaser through and through, but this little girl was like, no, this is who I am. And she's still like that. And her parents just happened to be supportive of her expression, of her proclamation, really. And that's great, but not all trans kids get that. But the struggle begins at a very young age. And so as a faith community, as a faith leader, what does that look like? Questions that you can ask yourself are, what does it look like for our children's ministry to be gender affirming? Considering that gender identity develops at 2 years old, they're in your nursery still, more or less part of your greater children's ministry or sort of your Sunday school is what I'm thinking of. And the next thing that starts to form, yes, please. Mm-hmm. 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 Oh yeah, absolutely. And another great example of that is as soon as you, I don't even know what the week is that you can determine this necessarily, but at a certain point in the pregnancy, you can find out if you're having a boy or a girl. And the first thing people will ask you oftentimes is, do you know, like, what are you having? Are you having a boy or a girl? We have parties to reveal unborn children's gender identity, and then it instructs all of the gifts oftentimes that those parents might get for that child. And so, yes, absolutely, it definitely begins long before they necessarily arrive. And I think we as a society are really still wrestling with, what does it look like to raise a child without a gender? Without a gender identity. They have a gender, but before they can tell you what that gender is or what that identity is, how do we raise a child in that environment? And I've thought a lot about it, because I don't want, if I can avoid it, I would like to not gender my child. But I also know that my wife's family is a pretty conservative Catholic family, and so if we name our child like pear tree or something, like they would think they would have some comments, and so the name for the child will probably be pretty gendered, but at the same time we can still nurture and raise that child similar to how a church might be able to, in an environment that doesn't assume too much about them until they tell us who that person is or who they are. And oftentimes for kids more like myself, who are not as sassy as some of the young trans kids I've met recently, that the telling of that story often starts with gender expression. What toys do they like to play with? What colors I hated having to wear dresses, right? You also can't assume that just because a little girl doesn't like to wear a dress that they are automatically going to grow up and declare that they're a man. Like, I'm not asking you to do that. But that was sort of a beginning of my wrestling with, like, why do you parents, you family, you society expect of me to wear a dress or to like the color pink or and I fought not just against dresses, but I would push back against a whole variety of things that would place me in the category of girl as a young kid in an attempt to express myself as the way that I understood myself. But I also grew up in a small town black Southern Baptist family, and so like ladies wore gloves to church, and that's just how it was. And so I didn't have a whole lot of opportunity to push kind of the envelope there. But I believe that faith communities can provide that space when they want to, when the intent is there to create that more welcoming space. And so gender identity, let me just note, as I'm sort of rolling through this, gender identity is how you perceive yourself, how you understand and perceive yourself. Gender expression is how you show that person to the world. And so someone could identify as a woman and yet express themselves in very masculine ways. And that's completely acceptable. And that doesn't necessarily mean that because they express themselves in a masculine way that they perceive themselves to be or understand themselves to be a man, or that their gender identity is a man, is one of a man, for example. So let's go to the bottom a little bit. And oftentimes this is kind of where folks have more questions and confusion can occur here. So please, if you have any questions, don't be afraid to ask. But sexual orientation in recent times has been started to be broken up a little bit. And the first time I encountered this difference between your sexual or physical attraction and your romantic or emotional attraction, or orientation is another word to use for attraction. I was sitting on a panel with a couple of, there was a lesbian couple who actually went to high school with one of them, and so we were about the same age. And then there was a high school teacher who was probably twice our age, so we were 25-ish, and that guy was probably 50-ish. And there were a bunch of high school students in the room, like drama students, and one of the young ladies raised her hand to ask a question, and to premise her question, she said, "I identify as a heterosexual biromantic." And then she proceeded with the question, which I don't remember. And at the time, I think we actually all had to ask her to restate the question because everyone's brains were like, the heck is heterosexual bi? Like, what is that? And we all kind of looked at each other a little bit like, do you know what she's talking about? And eventually one of us got up the nerve to say, because we're supposed to be like experts, right? We got up the nerve to say, can you explain to me what you mean when you say heterosexual biromantic? And that was the first time I had ever encountered sort of this difference between physical attraction and emotional attraction to someone. But what she meant was that physically, sexually, she as a woman was pretty solely attracted to the male body, the male presence. But romantically, she could have deep romantic emotional connection and relationship with people of both gender identities and expressions. And so that's my little story about the fact that it's okay for you to be a little confused by this if you are, and if not, great. But sexual attraction is fully physical. It's the sexual chemistry. It's the desire to sexually engage with someone. And romantic and romantic and emotional attraction, is more about sort of a deep, intimate, emotional connection with someone that goes beyond friendship. And that's where I've found where I found that I and others have struggled to understand the difference. And the last couple times I've used this example because I've been in predominantly Christian circles, and I believe that I am today as well. But the story of Jonathan and David is probably the best example that I can think of in Scripture that explains what romantic or emotional attraction means. That relationship between Jonathan and David, as presented to us in the Bible, is intended to imply more than friends. Not necessarily physical, not necessarily sexual, but still something more and deeper in connection than a traditional friendship might. Does the difference make sense? Does anyone have any questions about that, or stories or comments? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So just to sort of give an example or two, I'm pretty sure my wife's like, what is it, your ears itch when people talk about you? But I'm going to use my wife as an example, and I always do, because I'm pretty sure she won't ever be embarrassed, because she probably will never sit through one of my trainings. But her identity, so she was assigned female at birth. Her gender identity is woman, but her gender expression is androgynous, which would be on the other scale there a little bit. Sometimes she wants to present a little more feminine. Sometimes people perceive her to be a man. Quite often, actually. She works at a hospital, and so she wears scrubs, and her family's not well endowed in the chestal region, and so she's a little flat-chested, and so there's a little bit. Sometimes, if she's wearing kind of gender-neutral type clothes, many people will perceive her to be masculine. But beyond her clothing, sometimes the way that she'll sit, or the way that she will sort of use her hands, or the things that she might be interested in, will also lead people to believe that she's expressing herself in a more masculine way. And so she owns that she is androgynous. But she also identifies as pansexual. And pansexual is someone who is attracted to all genders and expressions. Doesn't mean they're attracted to all people. But that their attraction to people is not limited to their gender identity or their expression or their sex assigned at birth. The difference between pansexual and bisexual, which is a common, I think, misunderstanding, or just kind of difficult for some folks to get their head around, is that a bisexual person is attracted to men and women, whereas a pansexual person is attracted to any gender category. And what that requires are sort of our minds and our constructs, our understandings, to really grapple with is this idea that there are other genders beyond the two genders that are most prevalent in our society, which is man and woman. I identify as a trans man. In my sexuality, I use the word queer. So to give you another example of sort of how these identities might play out, I was assigned female at birth. My gender identity is man. My gender expression is masculine. I'm a pretty binary trans person. I am sexually, I use the word queer because as a trans man, I did previously come out as a lesbian. And I've never fully understood myself to be a straight person. And so as a trans man who's predominantly attracted to women, saying that I am straight as a man attracted to a woman feels odd to me. So I use queer to sort of own that oddity in my own life. But my sexual attraction is predominantly woman. I have dated men, and I thought they were attractive, and so I can't say that like I'm not attracted to men at all. But you'd be hard pressed at this point in my life to see me with a man. I just could never imagine doing that again. And romantically, though, I would say it's probably a little more nuanced. I most easily romantically connect with women. But again, I wouldn't say that I could never be romantically attracted to a man again, although you'd be hard-pressed to see that happen. Like, don't bet your life savings on it. So those are a couple examples. There are lots of terms, though, right? There's asexual and agender, there's demisexual, there's genderqueer, there's gender fluid. There are a lot of terms that get thrown out from time to time when we're talking about the LGBTQ community. Are there any that you would love some explanation about? That you've met someone, or you are sort of struggling to understand something about a certain identity, or what someone means when they say something that I could maybe answer for you. I probably should backtrack just a little bit and give you my philosophy on questions, because I have a couple. I'm a thinker by nature, and so my dominant philosophy on questions is that questions are one of our primary catalysts for learning, and if we are well, the reason that questions are a primary catalyst for learning is because they're a sign of genuine curiosity. And that curiosity can come from a variety of places. My other philosophy on questions is that we, as people who encounter all sorts of things in our lives, and we learn things as we go, we are oftentimes, once we have an answer to a question, we start to assume that other people know that information too. But when we don't know something, oftentimes it's difficult for us to know what we don't know. And so we don't really know what question to ask. Funny caveat of a story, our furnace is broken and winter is coming. It's really almost here. And we don't have a heater. So we are heating our house right now with a fireplace and a little space heater. And it's working out okay. But I had somebody come by the house to look at our furnace and try to tell us what's wrong. And while the technician was there, I had to be at work. And so my wife was there by herself. And I got a phone call. And she said to me in a somewhat frustrated tone, I don't even know what questions to ask. And then she hands the technician the phone. And I asked him a few questions, and then I explained to her what was going on. And but that can sometimes be sort of what we're feeling when we're in trainings such as this. And so even if so I tell you that story and that philosophy to also ask that if you have an identity that maybe you are familiar with but that you struggle to understand, and you think maybe someone else in this space could appreciate an explanation about a specific identity, you're also encouraged to ask that question as well. I will tell you one more. And that is demisexual, because it gets at this difference between sexual and romantic attraction a little bit more. Someone who identifies as demisexual would say that they cannot be sexually attracted to someone without a deep romantic or emotional attraction to that person. And so, like, they're not going to watch television and be like, wow, Halle Berry's really hot. Or, geez, Denzel Washington. I don't know why I'm thinking of actors of color right this second. But, they're not necessarily just going to look at someone and be like, wow, I would totally, have relations with that person. They need that sort of deep, romantic, emotional connection, and then they start to build from that a sexual chemistry or desire, which is a little different sometimes than what I've heard some people say about the LGBTQ community, but demisexuals, they're out there. There's a few of them. Yeah. which is totally different. Right. That's kind of interesting. That reminds me of an example that I use for sort of how we teach young people what gender is. Like if I taught a kid that a cow barks, they would believe me because they don't know, like, what's a bark sound like? Or, what's a cow? We're learning things at a rapid pace when we're young people. And people told me that what I was female, that I was a woman, that I would be attracted to men. And I owned it. But for me, my attraction to men was more that I wanted to be, like I thought they were hot because I wanted to look like them. But people told me that feeling was like I wanted to date them. And so I lived into that. We were experiencing different things and meaning different things, but we were using the same language. And so getting at sort of that, like what do we really mean, is always an interesting journey. Yeah. 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 Yeah, if only we could appreciate the intention of myth for its true, for what it's truly meant to be, and not necessarily limit the ability of God to only be tied to a myth. But there's something else that, we'll do it from the next slide here. There's something else that I think is really important when we're engaging LGBT people, and really anybody of any kind of diversity. And that is to remember that regardless of where we fall on this gender unicorn, because again, heterosexual, or so straight, cisgender is a term. It means that you were, if the gender you were assumed at birth is the same as the gender that you hold. So if I identified as a woman, I would be a cisgender woman because I was born female and I identify as a woman. So if you are straight, attracted to the opposite sex, and cisgender, you also have a gender identity and a gender expression and a sexual orientation and a sex assigned at birth. And so when we're working with people who may fall outside of what our society deems as normal, I think it's really important for us in all areas of diversity to focus on the person that we're engaging with, to carry and to sort of make it part of our DNA as a group, as a community of faith, the importance of individuals and the uniqueness that we all bring to this body. And one of the things that I heard a lot from my Southern Baptist side of the family was, there's no way you can be trans because God doesn't make mistakes. Or, why can't you just be gay? Because apparently that's not a mistake. But what I realized was behind some of the comments that I was getting was this assumption that I thought I was born in the wrong body. And I think that's a feeling that some trans people have, maybe, that some people will carry this, like, I was born incorrectly, and so I am going to go through these processes to change that incorrectness about my being. But I think that it would be a powerful message, and it has been for my life, to remember that I can only do what God has called me to do if I am willing to be the full and complete person that God created me to be. And that means that God did not make a mistake when God made me trans, right? That God is still as sovereign as God once was, in my mind, and that I would not be able to do the things that God would like for me to do, right? To talk about, from personal experience, about sort of discrimination against women in our society, or but be perceived as a man as I'm doing it, right? Like, that is going to be received differently because people will be looking at me differently when I start talking about it. I always say that I'm more of a feminist as a man than I ever was as a woman, and part of it is because now I understand the privilege that men get when people think I'm a man, or they perceive me as a man. And so I wouldn't be able to have those understandings if I weren't trans, because I wouldn't have been socialized as a woman for 23 years in order to bring those understandings into the work and the ministry that I do today. And that applies, again, to all sorts of diversity, right? Like, if I have a friend named Justin, an acquaintance, I suppose, named Justin, who I presented at a conference with once, and he's in a wheelchair. He's never been able to walk. I have no idea what he was diagnosed with or any of that. I'm not trying to make assumptions, but he would be classified as disabled in some way. But he is incredibly smart, incredibly funny, and we were, as we were presenting, he talked a lot about how his experience in the world has informed the work and the ministry that he does. And if he spent all of his life fighting the fact that he was created the way that he was created, he wouldn't be able to do the ministry that God was calling him to do. And if we as faith communities can fully engage in what it means to love the person, and to be in ministry with the people, rather than lumping people together under stereotypes or anything like that, even unintentionally, I think we will be better off for it. So what does that look like in ministry with LGBT people? So rather than saying, like, my gay friend Mark, I don't know a person named Mark who's gay, but I'm sure there's somebody out there. Instead of saying my gay friend Mark, we would say something more like my friend Mark, who also happens to be gay. Only if we actually need to talk about the fact that Mark is gay in the context of whatever this conversation is. And what that does is it frames for the people that we're talking with that Mark is a person first. Another thing that I hear a lot from a language perspective in churches is this conversation that it's the phrase brothers and sisters in Christ. And what that can do is leave out a lot of persons in your ministry, especially if you are leading a community of people who have a number of LGBT people as a part of that community. And so rather person-centered ministry would encourage phrases that don't limit identity or uniqueness in as many ways as possible. And so instead of saying black people, it would be people of color. Instead of saying, what was my other example I just used? Brothers and sisters in Christ. It would be friends and family, or members of the body of Christ, or siblings. Some folks use people have pushed back on me when I've suggested siblings because it's kind of an awkward word. But another phrase that I really think is fun, just because I want to say it out loud, is instead of like, oh yeah, my nieces and nephews, blah, 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 people will say my niblets, which I just think is endearing. So, now that we have sort of talked quite a bit about things that we can do, I also want to give us a little bit of a warning against things that we shouldn't do when we're trying to welcome LGBT people, and really focusing on our language, right? So we've talked about some assumptions that we shouldn't make about people in ministries, but there are also things that immediately will turn an LGBT person off. And so I pulled some terms to avoid from a resource that I really love, and it's GLAAD's Media Reference Guide. And so it's put together for news anchors and newspapers and members of the media to be inclusive in their reporting, which means it's meant to engage the majority of our society in a comfortable way. And so I think it's a pretty, even though it's not necessarily a faith-based resource, I think it's pretty useful. And I think it's interesting that some of the terms, many of the terms, especially the first couple there, are actually terms that have been made negative or offensive because of their use in the context of faith communities. So homosexual or homosexuality will immediately make someone think that you're about to tell them how bad and sinful homosexuality is, even though homosexual and homosexuality are scientific terms. But we also don't like walk around and call daisies by whatever their scientific name is. And so I would suggest, as with GLAAD, that we use other terms like gay or gay man or lesbian. And remember that in our person-centered ministry focus, again, that relationships are not homosexual relationships, they're just relationships. They're not even gay relationships or same-sex relationships, unless they absolutely, in the context of that conversation, need to be a same-sex relationship. They're simply a couple. They are partners, they are spouses. We don't necessarily need to classify the relationship much beyond that. Sexual preference, rather than using sexual preference, say sexual orientation. Special rights, rather than talk about how LGBT people need, special rights to exist in the world. We just need equal rights, equal protections. And that definitely comes in use when we're talking about advocating for justice for the LGBT community. Just a couple more. The gay lifestyle, is that a thing? I don't think it's a thing. I think gay people have lives and we live them. LGBT people have lives and we live them. We don't have an agenda is another one there at the bottom. Unless our agenda is making sure we have food in our cupboards and milk in our fridge, and if we drink milk. And a roof over our heads and clothes on our back, and that we can live healthy, happy lives, whatever that looks like for us. Our lifestyle is not anything, all together unique. An admitted homosexual or avowed homosexual sound like I've never actually heard anybody say that except in the United Methodist discipline, which is, we're not going to go there. Oh, really? In the Presbyterian Church too? Yeah, absolutely. Right? I practice a lot. Well trained. So rather, if you need to say that they're openly, for example, if I'm, talking with someone about, and I want about another person, and I want them to know that this person is out in their gay, it's okay for you to to tell their story as a gay person or something, I might say that, yeah, they're openly gay. Like they would love to talk to your class or to talk to your small group about what it means to be gay. That wouldn't put them in an awkward place, kind of thing. Then I might say, yeah, this person is open or out, or something like that. So just really, really, really quickly, I want to give you, like, not even the history of the word queer in its fullness, although if you ever want to research it, it has been linked in its etymology back to the word twerk in German, which I think it's funny that the word twerk and queer come from the same place. But right around sort of late 1980s, so queer had been used for about 30, 40, 50, 60 years as a negative term by that point. And the 1980s, this group of folks came together and formed the queer revolution. And people like to say, well, young people nowadays think it's okay, but really this started like 30 years ago. And in 1990 at the New York Pride Parade, they handed out a pamphlet, which was kind of like a war cry, that explained why they believed that we should reclaim the word queer. And in that pamphlet, it came the phrase, "We're here, we're queer, get used to it." That sort of protest chant started in 1990, or before that, but it was documented there in 1990. And since then, it has shifted a little bit from its like war cry, like we wake up, we're gay, but we're not just gay, like we're queer in that we're angry and we feel discriminated against or pushed out of society, and we want to fight for our presence. That's kind of how it was used in this pamphlet that I'm referencing. It has since evolved from that usage to being more of a umbrella term for different sexual orientation or gender identity or expression, the way sort of young people use it nowadays. But it's always important for us to remember that there are plenty of people who still have a very strong negative visceral reaction to the word queer. And so I would caution you to never put on someone that they are queer or that a part of the queer community, or use queer in any way to describe anybody else. If you identify as queer, then by all means, you are encouraged to say, I am here and I am queer. But there are many people who really have, it leaves a bad taste in their mouth. They have horrible memories of the game Smear the Queer, or the derogatory usage of the word. So much caution here. I probably should like put a caution tape thing across the slide or something, but I find it interesting for people to know that this usage of the word queer in a more positive light actually began about 30 years ago. Yeah, so we are at our time. It is 2:01, and I was basically just going to have some conversation here at the end about what you learned, and if you had any questions, I again encourage you to ask them, but I also don't want to hold you over, so I will also say my thank yous, and if anyone has any questions, feel free, or comments, feel free to come up and let me know. We are in the pilot phase of this training series, and so much of this is under great review before we launch an actual promoted sort of training series. And so feedback is very important to me. So if you have any feedback, please let me know. One last thing before I really fully shut up. Right here, I have sign-ons for the Ohio Faith Coalition for Non-Discrimination. It's a broad statement that says that we as people of faith affirm LGBT identities and the dignity and divinity of human life. And that because of that, we believe that LGBT people deserve the same protections under the law as every other minority group has. So if you would like to sign that, you can either go to ohiofaithcoalition.org and click on the big button right in the middle of the page, or I have the form here, and I would encourage you, some of you actually have signed already, but I would encourage you to consider. Thank you. Appreciate it.